What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. This video is, oh gosh, the entire history of women's wrestling. This video is suggested by Jake Reinhardt, so thank you, man. If you guys have any suggestions, please comment in the comment section below or on my posts on my channel. And yeah, let's get into it.
WWE has had a long history when it comes to women's wrestling, and we've seen our fair share of highs and lows during this period. But how did we?
We have watched a few WWE things. If you guys do want to watch those, they're on my channel. But yeah, let's
get to where we are today. Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at right now in the entire history of women's wrestling in WWE. It all began in 1953. That was the year Vince McMahon Sr. created the Capitol Wrestling Corporation, the territory which would soon go on to become the main one in New York and the surrounding tri-state area. As you would expect though, back then, wrestling was very much a man's game, with the women really playing the role of a sideshow, a novelty act that could be brought into any given show to break up the monotony a little. So understandably, this meant there really wasn't a women's division to speak of in the Capitol Wrestling Corporation. No, back during that era, the entire thing was pretty much run with an iron fist by the Fabulous Moolah and Billy Wolf. So all the
it was the Fabulous Moolah that we reacted to.
New York audience would be exposed to here then would be the occasional visit to the territory from Moolah, as she showed up once in a while to defend her NWA Women's World Championship against whomever she felt deserved to share a little bit of the spotlight with her on that evening. And this would continue to be the case all the way up until 1983, by which point the CWC had morphed twice, first into the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and then again into the slightly shorter World Wrestling Federation. What changed about the way things were going as the 80s got into full swing? Well, after having purchased the rights to the NWA Women's World title back in the 70s, the Fabulous Moolah would go on to sell the belt and all booking power over it to the new owner of the New York territory, Vince McMahon Jr. Yes, as part of his push to expand his company nationally, Vince McMahon had plans to add a real women's division to WWF for the first time, something he was no doubt inspired to do after he was able to get Cyndi Lauper to appear on a number of his shows. After all, with Lauper having a huge female audience back then as one of the most popular pop stars out there, the belief was that if she could bring these women in, then all McMahon would have to do would be to give them some stars that would keep them watching after the fact. So that was why he began scouring the territories for a woman who could serve as his female equivalent of Hulk Hogan here, someone he eventually found in Wendi Richter. What made Richter the perfect choice for this role in the mid-80s? Well, she had the look, for one, and she could go in the ring too, so it made all the sense in the world that she'd get the rocket strapped to her, with this becoming apparent to audiences when she won the now renamed WWF Women's Championship at the Brawl to End It All on July 23, 1984. That's right, after the Fabulous Moolah had technically held that belt for 28 years, it was finally time for a new babyface star to take her mantle and run with it, something Wendi immediately set about doing as the months progressed from there. Unfortunately though, any dreams the Dallas native might have had about taking women's wrestling to new levels here never really came to fruition. And the reason for
is the quality good? Okay.
That was because pretty quickly after WrestleMania 1, Vince McMahon started to get bored of the idea of a women's division on his show. So it was that while Hulk Hogan was going to unforeseen heights over in the men's division, Wendi Richter was stuck playing the role of side act, just as so many women before her had been stuck doing so. As you would expect then, she wasn't
she the one who was cheated out of like because we did watch the Fabulous Moolah, wasn't she the one that was like cheated out of a championship?
Very happy about this, and she let that be known to her bosses whenever she had the chance. How would Vince McMahon react to such feelings? Well, he'd end up taking the belt off of Richter in the worst possible way when on November 25th, 1985, he enacted the original screw job when he had a woman under a mask who was later revealed to be the Fabulous Moolah.
Oh my gosh,
shoot on Wendi
I'm getting my own answer. I'm getting
the
answer to my own question.
As you would expect then, with this ending the now former champion's time in WWF, as she'd be fired as soon as the bout was over, she'd want nothing more to do with the company in the years which followed. And that would be symbolic of how the relationship between WWF and women's wrestling would go over the next era as it happened, because while the division would still technically be active for another couple of years, and would include names like Sensational Sherry, Velvet McIntyre, and Rockin' Robin, by the end of the 80s, it would be completely done. But it wouldn't be done forever. No, in 1993, Vince McMahon would make another attempt at reviving the whole thing when, in the face of sagging business during the New Generation era, he decided to try and give his company a boost with an addition of some female talent again. Who would be the people who made up the division this time around? Well, there would be Alundra Blaze, the woman handpicked by the boss to be the new face of women's wrestling in the WWF, serving as the anchor of the entire thing. Aside from that, though, there wasn't really much else to write home about, and that would be a major problem. Sure, most of Blaze's opponents during the mid-90s would be very talented. We're talking about performers such as Bertha Faye and Bull Nakano here, but there was never really any focus given to the matches these ladies had against the champ. Hell, aside from Alundra, none of the women here ever really got much of a character, and they certainly didn't get any real storylines to sink their teeth into. No, as the months went on with this second attempt at creating a women's...
When did women's wrestling start getting really, really good? What do you think was the peak?
Division in WWF, it was quickly becoming clear that, like with the way things had gone back in the 80s, Vince McMahon just wasn't that interested in women's wrestling, and so was only going to make a half-hearted attempt at making his division a thing. And like before, this once again led to the face of said division growing increasingly frustrated to the point that she would exit the company herself in December of 1995. This time though, the champ wouldn't leave after getting screwed, rather she'd be the one doing the screwing. As when Alundra Blaze jumped over to WCW, she'd do so with the title still in her possession, a title she then immediately proceeded to drop into the trash on a live episode of
seen this.
Nitro. Clearly then, this looked like it would be the end of the women's division in the WWF, so with that done, for the next couple of years, things would go back to the level of the only ladies on the show being valets like Sunny, Marlena, Deborah, and Sable. That said, some sparks of life would be brought back in September of 1998, as that was when, following the addition of accomplished wrestlers like Molly Holly, Ivory, and Jacqueline, we'd get another reintroduction of the WWF Women's Championship. But even if the women's title was back again, it wasn't like the division had much worth talking about here.
I do need to watch 10 worst belt designs. That video will be coming.
The lowest point yet for the ladies of WWF, as most of the matches they were involved in were less wrestling contests and more things like bikini contests. So if you were a women's wrestler who wanted to be taken seriously back in the late 90s, it was obvious that WWF was not the place to be, with the lone exception to this rule seeming to be Chyna. Who was Chyna? Well, she was a force of nature, a female of such impressive physical stature that she was more jacked than half the men on the roster during the Attitude Era. So, when she broke out in a big way in the late 90s, it redefined what a woman in WWF could be. Sure, this wouldn't lead to much of a revival for the women's division overall or anything, as for the most part, Chyna was specifically in storylines and matches with the men. But that in itself was a huge step forward because as the new millennium dawned, she'd become not only the first woman to enter a men's Royal Rumble match, but also the first, and to date, only woman to ever win the Intercontinental title. Unfortunately though, by the time 2001 came around, Chyna was gone from the company. And with that, the brief high that women in WWF had reached was over, right? Well, not exactly, because it was around here that two new ladies entered the fray, two ladies by the names of Trish Stratus and Lita. Sure, they may have started off in the same fitness model vein that so many others before them had, but over time, Trish and Lita would break out of that box by presenting themselves as more than just eye candy. Really, above all else, they were wrestlers, and this saw them be able to do things like make history by main eventing an episode of Raw in 2004. And they weren't the only ones who were helping to create a real mini-boom for women's wrestling back during the mid-2000s, as, elsewhere, there were also high-level acts on the show like Mickie James, Jazz, and Gail Kim, each of whom were more than capable of having a legitimately good match. Or at least they were capable of doing so within the limitations that had been placed upon them. That's right, this was still a period when the women were regularly being told to slow down and not do so much in the ring so that they didn't end up outshining the men. And those weren't the only things stopping them from fully being taken seriously here, as, while they were showing themselves to be more athletes than eye candy, the overall presentation still made this hard for them to get taken as seriously as they should, as there remained plenty of bikini contests and the likes on the show. Even then though, with all the limitations placed upon them, what the women did here, particularly Trish Stratus and Lita, was enough to make the entire era worthwhile, as they really set a template which would eventually be followed up on years later. Unfortunately, however, that follow-up would not happen for a while because by the time the 2000s was coming to an end and the PG era was dawning, things would hit a new low again. What happened this time? Well, after Trish and Lita both retired, and after
Wasn't,
others
didn't,
such as Mickey...
okay, so they brought up Gail Kim. Wasn't she... Didn't she, like, quit in a very obvious way? Like, she just, like, left the ring? Or was that a different wrestler?
James, Gail Kim, and Jacqueline headed over to TNA. Back over in WWE, the era of the Divas was about to take hold. That's right, while the new PG direction of the show would put an end to things like the Playboy photo shoots and the more titillating match types, it wasn't like we were suddenly in the modern era of women's wrestling in WWE yet. No, we were still a ways away from that. What will we get in place of this? Well, a regression of the division in many ways, because now any kind of high-quality matches the ladies were allowed to sneak through pretty much disappeared, as it all once again became about fitness models who could fit the Divas branding, ladies who'd often been hired based on their looks more than anything else. So much would the Divas moniker come to define this era. In fact, it would be here that we got the introduction of the Divas title.
I think that was the main problem. Once they got later into, like, the 2000s, it did seem like that. It wasn't as much as about talent. It was more about
which, at least initially, operated side by side along with the women's title. But as time went on and there became no need for two singles belts for the women in WWE, largely on account of the division being so threadbare, both prizes would be merged into one, as the Divas title became the only one left in the company. Needless to say then, this was a low time to be a women's wrestling fan, as during the periods where the division had been active, this was arguably the lowest ebb it had reached yet. Sure, there were high points to be found there, such as with Beth Phoenix, Natalya Neidhart, and Lay Cool. However, overall, things were still not great. Yes, it was here that the division was dominated by people like Kelly Kelly and Candice Michelle, but then it's not as if they were really to blame for the lows we got here. No, these were women who were just being hired for a role. Hell, there were even cases of some of those ladies actively trying to improve, but being shut down behind the scenes before they could take any of these improvements to the ring. After all, the ladies did about as much as they could at this time, even going as far as to bring in a whole new audience of young girls with things like Total Divas and later Total Bellas. And then when NXT became a full-blown developmental system in 2012, it didn't take the ladies long to move things in a new direction, as with Triple H booking the show here instead of Vince McMahon, the ladies were suddenly allowed to do a lot more. And it was in the midst of all this that the likes of Paige and Emma rose to the forefront. That said, when these women made it up to the main roster and joined AJ Lee and desperately trying to keep things afloat, the old problems remain. And then something happened. In early 2015, after a tag team match pitting Paige and Emma against the Bella Twins on an episode of Raw was given 29 seconds of in-ring time, fans reached a breaking point and started a Twitter hashtag calling for WWE to give Divas a chance. How did WWE respond to this? Well, they started making plans to change up the division. Luckily then, they didn't have to do a lot of work when it came to putting these plans into action, as by that point, down in NXT, the women's division was catching fire with a whole new crop of excellent talent who were often outshining the men. That's right, this was the point.
Personally, I don't think they ever were taken seriously, in my opinion.
The four horsewomen entered the fray, a quartet of ladies who'd all become friends during their time on the developmental brand, and whose ranks were made up of names like Sasha Banks, Charlotte Flair, Becky Lynch, and Bayley. Together, they'd been able to have a series of matches down in Florida that had completely raised the bar for what women's wrestling could be in the WWE system. Hell, to this day, the match between Sasha and Bayley at TakeOver Brooklyn on August 22, 2015 is held up as one of the best matches in WWE history and one of the best women's matches to ever take place. Really then, is it any surprise that fans were seeing this being booked on NXT and growing increasingly frustrated about what they were seeing on the main roster? And it also shouldn't be a surprise that around about the same time as that iconic Brooklyn match took place, three of the horsewomen in Banks, Flair, and Lynch would all get called up to the main roster. How would things go from there? Well, there was a bit of a rocky start. Come WrestleMania 32, things were starting to cook, as this trio of ladies was able to steal the show right out from under all the men at the Showcase of the Immortals. And in doing so, they'd create a true turning point in the division, as this was the moment the Divas moniker was finally retired, as the Divas title was deactivated, and Charlotte Flair became the new WWE Women's Champion. As you would expect then, Fans were very happy with this because for the first time in the company's history, it felt like WWE were truly taking women's wrestling seriously on the main roster. And that continued to be the case as over the year or so which followed, a series of firsts happened when we got both the first ever women's pay-per-view main event and the first ever women's Hell in a Cell match between Sasha Banks and Charlotte at October 2016's Hell in a Cell pay-per-view. Meanwhile, as this was happening, down in NXT, things were continuing to be pushed forward, as with Bayley now carrying things as the top babyface of the division, she'd get the chance to work with a whole host of new incoming talent which would eventually go on to take over from the Hugger when she herself was called up to the main roster full-time in 2017. Yes, now that the Four Horsewomen had successfully laid the groundwork, the developmental brand could continue to keep the good times going with the introduction of acts like Asuka, Io Shirai, and eventually both Rhea Ripley and Toni Storm. Hell, many of those women would have actually been able to get a direct pipeline to NXT via the Mae Young Classic, a women's knockout tournament WWE started doing here, which brought in some of the top female talent from around the world for a tryout of sorts. And as the years went on, most of those names would go on to become big stars on the main roster too, as by the time the decade was drawing to a close, the ladies were continuing to break down
Sorry I'm not talking so much. I'm really trying to just learn the history.
boundaries that would ultimately put them on par with the men. Seriously, not long after the first Women's Royal Rumble match took place in January of 2018, we'd get the first ever Women's Elimination
This is actually
Chamber
entertaining
match
to watch.
and the first ever Women's Money in the Bank ladder match as well. And
Even
as
though
if
I'm
that
not
weren't
really
enough, it would also
Even though I'm not really a wrestling fan, it's still like, you know.
be around here that the women's tag team titles were introduced, with the first duo to hold these being the Boss and Hug Connection. Clearly then, this was a sign that the division was expanding exponentially. But then, this fast expansion had already been clear for all to see once the brand split had been reinstituted back in 2016, and there were suddenly 2 world titles again for the women. That's right, both the Raw and SmackDown brands got their own top prizes again here, with this only adding more opportunities for women to make it all the way to the top of the card. But even with all this progress, there were still a few things the ladies of WWE hadn't yet done, with one of the biggest of these being to have their own pay-per-view. Luckily then, they would get just that when on October 28, 2018, Evolution would take place, the first ever women's-only show in WWE history. And this took place partly because it had been mere months earlier that Ronda Rousey had joined the company. Yes, given the fact that she was probably the most famous female athlete on the planet back in 2018, Ronda Rousey signing on the dotted line with WWE here to become a full-time performer was seen as a major moment for the company, and one which only incentivized Vince McMahon to push his women's division even harder.
But they could have done that earlier.
But she wouldn't be the only star from outside the company making an appearance here. No, Evolution would also serve as something of a love letter to the history of the women's division.
Sorry talking over him, but they only did that because Ronda Rousey signed
in WWE, as it would see a lot of names from the past return too. Names like the Bella Twins, Trish Stratus, and Lita. Of course, for as exciting as it was to see all these stars come together again though, and for as much as Ronda Rousey drew the house in the main event, even she wasn't the most talked about performer at Evolution. No, that would have to be Becky Lynch. Why was this? Well, it was only a couple of months prior that Becky had caught fire with her anti-hero character of The Man, a Stone Cold Steve Austin-esque figure for the PG era. And when we say caught fire here, we mean it, because Lynch would get so over in 2018 and 2019, it dwarfed anything any other woman had ever been able to do before, even the likes of Chyna from back in the day. So over would the Irish woman be as the decade was drawing to a close. In fact, she'd become the most talked about person in the entire industry, male or female, especially after that iconic scene of her standing up in the crowd with a busted nose was seen by fans around the world. Really, with Roman Reigns temporarily gone here to deal with his cancer diagnosis, it was quickly becoming undeniable that Becky was the biggest star in the entire company. And that meant when WrestleMania 35 came around a few months later, there would be no other choice than to go with the ace of the promotion in the closing spot of the show. That's right, for the first time ever in a major wrestling company, a woman would not only be the #1 act in the territory, but they would also be main eventing the biggest show on the calendar. And not just any biggest show on the calendar, no, they'd be main eventing WrestleMania. Of course, Becky wasn't alone in doing this here, however, as the final bout that night would be a 3-way, pitting her against then Raw Women's Champion Charlotte Flair, and then SmackDown Women's Champion Ronda Rousey. Who won this historic match? Well, that would be The Man, of course. And over the next 12 months, Lynch would continue to be one of the top names in the entire industry, if not the top, By then, though, there were several women who were at that level of being amongst the top names in the industry. We're talking about Sasha Banks and Charlotte Flair, amongst others. Hell, it would be at WrestleMania 37 that the Boss also etched her name in the history books when she and Bianca Belair main evented Night 1 of the Showcase of the Immortals. Come 2022, however, Sasha Banks would be gone from WWE. So in her place, some new names were going to need to step up. Luckily then, it was around here that with Triple H taking over the reins of creative on the main roster, some of the people that he pushed the hardest down in NXT would rise to the forefront. And amongst them, the most notable would probably be Io Sky, Liv Morgan, and of course, Rhea Ripley. Yes, one of the biggest acts of the current era in WWE, Rhea Ripley would take the women's division to new heights again with some of the best women's matches we've ever seen. And while she was doing that, a now Shawn Michaels run developmental was continuing to build for the next generation by assembling the best women's divisions in the world. Why was that? Well, because it included some truly impressive, mostly homegrown talent in the form of Roxanne Perez, Tiffany Stratton, and Lyra Valkyria, as well as some of the best free agent signings from around the world in performers such as Stephanie Vaquer and Julia. All of this is to say that, as things stand now, the WWE Women's Division has never been stronger. Now we've reached a point where it's not even a big deal anymore to see the ladies main event a big show, or for them to put on the best match of a given card. And it's the continued success of the WWE Women that has seen even more recent additions in 2025. What are these additions? Well, they're mid-card titles, a new thing for this era of the company. That's right, it was in recent months that Women's United States and Women's Intercontinental titles were created, something which only further added to the forward progress the ladies.
Hopefully they keep getting main events and, you know, all that, get treated the same as the men, because they can be just as entertaining.
Have been making for the last decade now. That said, for as much as it's the four horsewomen and beyond who have taken things to new levels in WWE when it pertains to their gender, really, this is something which goes back decades, as even as far back as the days of people like Wendy Richter and Leilani Kai, the women have been doing everything they could to be taken seriously. So whether we're talking about those early trailblazers, the females who kept things afloat during the often dark times, or the ladies who stood on the shoulder of those giants to finally lead a women's revolution in WWE, everyone deserves credit for getting things to the point they're at today, a point where the women can headline any show on any given night.
Yeah, that was a very interesting and entertaining video. I didn't really talk much because I just wanted to listen, because I don't watch WWE, so yeah, I just wanted to listen more than talk, I guess. But yeah, thank you, Jake Reinhardt, for suggesting this video. I really enjoyed it. If you guys did enjoy this video, please give it a like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.